You're listening to Puma Podcast.
On August 24, 1965, the Philippine Board of Censors issued a permit for Iginuit ng Tadhana, a movie about the life of Juan Ferdinand Marcos. The film cast a Ilocano as a decorated World War II soldier, a patriot, a brilliant lawyer who married a beauty queen from Leyte, Imelda. Marcos became the representative of Ilocos Norte at the House of Representatives. Then he became a senator. He was the sitting Senate president when Iginuit ng Tadhana was produced. And when it received its permit for release, Marcos was running for president. Senator Marcos' 8-year-old son, Bongbong, had a cameo playing himself.
I'll give them many gamot at damit.
And one of the most popular actors of the day, Luis Gonzalez, played Marcos.
Napakahalaga sa akin. Ang gagawin kong vision bukas.
The black and white film was a pioneering effort in the politics of 1965. So novel, so powerful was the idea that the movie and the campaign, quite inevitably, would not go unchecked.
At kung sadyang yan ang iginuwit ng tadhana sa iyong buhay.
After a single screening at the Live Theater in Manila, the Board of Censors suddenly rescinded its permit. Upon pressure, the Marcos camp believed, from the incumbent re-electionist, President Diosdado Macapagal. The Marcos camp turned to a young new lawyer in their team. Some called him Johnny, others called him Juancho. Johnny, or Juancho, in turn pulled in the deputy legal counsel of the Nacionalista Party, a litigator 6 years his senior, whom people had come to simply call Ding Dong. Together, attorneys Juancho and Ding Dong, representing the movie's producers, argued their case within 3 weeks, all the way to the Supreme Court, where they won. The film and the controversy its banning generated, many believe these doomed Macapagal's campaign and boosted Marcos. Iginuit ng Tadhana translates literally to drawn by destiny. But if the movie had anything to do with the Marcos presidency, so must it have been crucial to the fate of those who helped unleash its impact. Johnny, or Juancho, would later say that Ding Dong would write him a note a few years later to say that surely, quote, we who had worked hard on Iginuit ng Tadhana will be given the opportunity to contribute to the achievement of our national aspirations. How exactly? In 1965, neither Johnny nor Ding Dong knew.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me your oath of office. I...
Hello, ako po si Robbie Alampay, Puma Podcast. You're listening to 100 Years of Juan Ponce Enrile in the Philippines. This is the last of a special 2-part series produced by Puma Podcast for our Teka Teka news program. In time for the 100th birthday of one of the most controversial and consequential figures in modern Philippine history, we are revisiting the last century of this country through the life lens of the century-old JPE. Research for this podcast leaned on news archives, publicly available records, Enrile's autobiography edited by the journalist Nelson Navarro, Juan Ponce Enrile, a memoir. And for interview elements with Enrile himself, we relied on the library of Probe Archives. In the previous episode, we traced Enrile's early years, from his birth in 1924 in a fishing village in Cagayan until 1965, when after decades of poverty, deprivation, and marginalization, and after all that World War II could inflict upon him, he somehow emerged intact as a lawyer and joined the Marcos government as Undersecretary of Finance. Enrile would not only be Undersecretary of Finance, he was made chairman of the Philippine National Bank, acting head of the Insurance Commission, and then, concurrent to all of that, Commissioner of the Bureau of Customs. Marcos asked Johnny Enrile to improve collections at Customs. Enrile gathered the bureau managers for lunch. He asked, how much of every peso in duties actually goes to the national coffers? One woman alone around a table dominated by men spoke up. About 50%. The rest, she said, is split between the importers and bureau personnel. Enrile was dumbfounded. Everybody knows that bribes and corruption go on at Customs. But 50%. For immediate results, but also mindful not to be spit out by an entrenched corrupt bureaucracy, Enrile says he told the customs officers raise the government share to 80%, and there will be no more questions about the missing 20%. Enrile says he then spent the rest of his time at the Bureau trying to institute more lasting reforms and efficiencies. The rot would never completely go away, but customs collections did indeed soar. The Manila Chronicle, owned by the Lopez family, to which Marcos Vice President Fernando Lopez belonged, wrote a glowing editorial urging the new president to protect the new commissioner, the Bureau of Customs. Marcos was elated. The president was still only 51 and many years lay ahead for him. Johnny Enrile, for his part, was only 44 and already the most trusted man of the most powerful man in the Philippines. And both of them would only grow even more powerful.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to land on the moon in July 1969, Finance Undersecretary Juan Ponce Enrile must have joined an estimated 500 million people worldwide who stopped to watch the largest audience for a live television broadcast at the time. Adventures into space made for shared dreams and wonder across all borders, and those borders were momentarily erased by satellites that were precisely making simultaneous live international broadcast possible. Say, for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, the first games with a truly global audience. Apart from the Manila Chronicle, the Lopezes owned the Chronicle Broadcasting Network, or CBN, too. In June of 1968, they relayed live coverage of the funeral of U.S. Senator Robert Kennedy. Technology was a uniting force. But make no mistake, in the 1960s and all through the 70s, barriers and borders remained very much real. After World War II, nationalist movements from Latin America to Africa and Asia were agitating for independence. Colonial empires in every continent were being dismantled. Two competing poles for a new world order emerged, around America and the communist Soviet Union, while in Asia, a rising China was spreading its revolution. Between the communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, who led the Vietnamese movement against the French colonial powers, and leaders like General Suharto, who would grab power and then lead a massacre of hundreds of thousands of communists in Indonesia, Southeast Asia was staged for proxy wars that enabled the rise of strongmen who in turn exploited the superpowers' eagerness not only to support, but to bribe if need be. In the Philippines, President Marcos, with Enrile and other financial managers, poured resources not only into populist, and many economists say ill-advised infrastructure projects, but also into a military feeding off communist fears. Not to mention emerging secessionist movements in Mindanao to the south and the Cordilleras in the north. In 1968, moreover, the Communist Party of the Philippines was born.
Mr. Marcos is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines.
That same year, a neophyte senator from the Liberal Party, Benigno Ninoy Aquino, sounded the alarm on what he called a ballooning armed forces budget. Aquino said Marcos was militarizing our civilian government. Enrile was 7 years older than Ninoy, but because of his handicapped and repeatedly delayed education, they knew each other from the 1950s. Their days overlapped at the University of the Philippines College of Law. In 1969, by the time Marcos won a second term, the names of Marcos and Aquino, with Enrile always lurking in the background, were intertwined. In Marcos' second term, Enrile was moved and promoted to Secretary of Justice. Other notable appointments to the new cabinet: Carlos P. Romulo, the diminutive advisor to Douglas MacArthur in World War II. Romulo was named Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Odi Corpus, who was with Enrile in Harvard in the 1950s, became Education Secretary. And beyond the cabinet, by the way, Juancho Enrile's partner in lifting the censor's ban on the ginuit na tadhana in 1965, Attorney Ding Dong. Ding Dong was appointed to the Supreme Court, more formally now, as Associate Justice Claudio Tihanqui. Enrile was among the youngest in the new cabinet. He immediately worked to bring in more new blood into the DOJ. He would recall hiring a future judge, a fresh graduate of UP Law,
I hired her in 1969 to work
named
for
Miriam
me
Defensor.
in the Department of Justice When she got married, she asked me and my wife to be her wedding sponsor.
Enrile did not last in the DOJ, but only because 1 year later he was named Secretary of Defense. And then
1970.
he resigned that post too, to join the Nacionalista administration senatorial slate for the midterm elections of 1971. 2 months before those elections, grenades exploded at a Liberal Party rally in Plaza Miranda in Quiapo. 9 died, 95 others were seriously injured, including the popular re-electionist Jovito Salonga. As his life hung in the balance in the hospital, Salonga won another term as senator, along with 4 other liberals. The Nacionalistas had only 3 bets in the winner's circle. Enrile was not among them. Journalist Nelson Navarro, who edited Enrile's memoirs, says the blasts wounded Enrile's ambitions too.
Kasi siya ang lawyer, siya yung DND, he started falling in the ratings.
Yun ang kikinatalo ko. I carried the burden.
Already resigned from the cabinet, Enrile saw the laws as signed to leave government altogether. With former UP Law classmates, including a Sigma Rho fraternity brother, Edgardo Angara, Enrile co-founded their own firm, the Angara Abelio Concepcion Regala and Cruz Law Office, or ACRA Law, only for Enrile to leave everything to his partners. The second-termer President Marcos had called again.
Come back here because I just announced your reappointment as Secretary of National Defense, sabi niya. I really believe in his ability to run the country. Up to that point,
Who was behind the Plaza Miranda bombing? The opposition pointed at Marcos. Enrile and the president blamed the Communist Party of the Philippines. All sides would deny involvement, but 1 year later, when Enrile's car is ambushed outside the Wakwak subdivision in Mandaluyong, and when martial law is declared the very next day, observers would string it all together and conclude that everything must have been part of Marcos' grand plan. This much, Enrile would later admit to the world. The attack on his vehicle that day had indeed been staged. Enrile says that days prior, he was already privy to what would follow. And after the supposed ambush on his car, he said he was handed files to review.
Dala-dala niya yung brown envelope. Tinignan ko, nandun lahat yung mga ginawa na orders. Sabi niya, as of 9 o'clock tonight, we'll be under martial law.
The order caused the arrest of oppositionists, journalists, lawyers, activists, students, religious workers, labor and farm organizers. Enrile would over the decades deny being among its architects, but there was no denying that the defense secretary was martial law's chief implementer.
Lahat ng kapangyarihan ng martial law sa akin idinagsa. Arrest warrants, curfew, travel, media control, lahat sa akin idindelegate yun. Tawag nga sa akin si Julie designated representative.
The morning after the declaration, he headed straight to Malacanang. The streets were empty of vehicles. All radio stations were silent. The first person he ran into was Imelda Marcos, who, smiling, blurted out, "Ang dali pala ng Marcelo."
Nung primero, ayaw nga ni Presidente Marcos lumitaw eh. Nung first day, ako ang nakipagpulong sa mga kabinete. At marami sa kanila hindi naniniwala doon sa deklarasyon ng Marcelo. Natatakot sila, hindi nila alam. Walang nakakalam kung saan pupunta yung Marcelo eh.
Among the powers delegated to him, presidential decrees that Marcos cloaked himself with, as well as a draconian Internal Security Act, which gave the government broad powers to maintain internal security, suppress dissent, and prevent threats to the state. Enrile directed orders to the Philippine Constabulary and its then 44-year-old Director General Fidel Valdez Ramos. Marcos would dissolve the bicameral Congress. Elections set for 1973 would be cancelled. He would appoint all members of the judiciary and was now firmly a dictator with both legislative and executive powers. He remembers Marcos' Agriculture Secretary, Arturo Tanco, pulling him aside.
Sabi niya, how sure are we that we are doing the right thing? Nobody is sure, kako daw. it's too late to ask that question. Each one of us will make a decision whether we stay or not we stay.
Enrile stayed, not only until the official lifting of martial law in 1981, but until its true end, which came with the fall of Marcos in 1986. Did they do the right thing? Between 1972 and 1986, thousands of Filipinos were documented to have been arrested without warrant, abused, tortured, murdered, or disappeared. Over the same period, the national debt surged from $2 billion to $26 billion. In 1965, Marcos had inherited an economy on par and by some measures stronger than Asian economies like that of South Korea, Taiwan, and Malaysia. 20 years later, by 1985, the Philippines experienced negative growth while its neighbors made remarkable economic progress. So precipitous was the impact. The armed wing of the New People's Army steadily became bigger and stronger during the martial law years. The performance was not only dismal, it was scandalous. While poverty incidence went from 40% in the 1970s to an estimated 60% by 1985, signs of widespread and personal corruption hounded the government, the first couple, Ferdinand and Imelda, and their cronies. A contract with Westinghouse to build the country's first nuclear power plant in Bataan was exposed to involve around $80 million in kickbacks. A fund was established to support the development of the coconut industry. But while rural folks suffered all throughout the country, the Coco Levy Fund, billions of pesos in taxes collected from coconut farmers, were documented to have been diverted by then-President Marcos. Money went instead to his associates, including Eduardo Dandingcoangco, whom, it was argued in court, used the funds to gain control of the San Miguel Corporation. Enrile was among those charged for diverting up to 840 million pesos. While Marcos and Imelda themselves famously went on buying sprees all over the world and amassed billions of dollars in stolen wealth, Enrile's own fortunes grew. Enrile's Jaca Corporation had interests in logging, real estate, and agriculture, including the coconut industry. Enrile said Jaca was always above board and could explain any questions about the provenance of his money. Nelson Navarro again, editor of Enrile's Memoirs.
When I joined public service in 1966, I incorporated myself into Jaca Incorporated. The taxes I paid. If you're interested in finding out about the state of my financial holdings, please, we will open all the files.
But there was no escaping the suspicions of the public. Enrile's own son, Jack, said they could not escape the gaze and taunts of their own neighbors right in their own exclusive gated communities.
May biglang tatlong grade 7. Tuta ni Marcos, they were taunting me. At nung medyo lumaban ako ng konti, binugbog po ako. Umuwi po ako dito, dugo-dugo po yung aking uniforme. I had a split on my lower lip. It required 14 stitches. Nung nakita ng nanay ko, tinanong niya sa akin, ano nangyari sa'yo? Sabi ko, naglaro ako ng football. Siguro I was about mga 11, 12 years old. Dumudungaw po ako at meron mga batang naglalakad papuntang park kasi dyan po yung park. Hapon-hapon, sumisigaw sila doon, papadaan. Ang sigaw nila, tuta ni Marcos, tuta ni Marcos. So, ang pagkakakilala po ni Jack doon sa kanyang mga magulang, parang napakasamang mga tao. Mahirap pong hindi maniwala dahil napakarami po nagsasabi.
Enrile carried on his duties as Defense Secretary. It was 1982, a secessionist movement continued to fester in Mindanao. Communist insurgents were gaining in numbers, and in the streets, protesters were becoming bolder. Enrile says even he was aware of the Marcos government becoming weaker and destabilized. Meanwhile, Senator Ninoy Aquino, released from Fort Bonifacio in 1980 for medical treatment in the U.S., was preparing to return to the Philippines after 3 years in exile. Ninoy spoke to Filipinos living in the States.
I have a death sentence waiting for me.
and Betamax tapes of his speeches were smuggled back into the Philippines.
Senator Tañada, who arrived last week from Manila and went to Boston.
Copied and recopied until scratchy, hissy tapes were played behind closed doors in homes and gatherings.
Danny, I want it very, very clear. I want you to explain this to Ninoy very carefully so that there will be no misunderstanding. If he returns to the Philippines, he will have to go back to jail.
As news and anticipation of Ninoy's return spread, Enrile says everybody, Imelda Marcos included, tried to warn Aquino to stay away.
I believe that real suffering, bravely borne, melts even a heart of stone.
On August 21, 1983, Ninoy Aquino was shot and killed at the Manila International Airport.
That we cannot do it by force of arms because we have no arms. But civil disobedience becomes a sacred duty when the state has become lawless or corrupt. When a citizen who barters with
Ninoy's widow, Cory, their children, Balsi, Pinky, Noy Noy, and a 10-year-old Chris returned from Boston. The opposition, outraged and fueled by the murder of Ninoy, but also feared to be fragmented by it, was in need of a leader.
It will mean victory because we are different from those that we oppose.
Marcos' former party mate, the former nationalista Senator Jose Pepe Diokno, was a popular figure, but he was reputedly in deteriorating health. It was Cory, the widow, who emerged as the unlikely tip of the spear for a united opposition. Marcos called for snap elections in 1985. International observers were one in condemning massive, blatant cheating and harassment. The president was losing even more credibility among allies both at home and abroad. He was unpopular in Cebu, and in the major city of Davao in Mindanao, a respected civic leader, Soledad Roa Duterte, was effective in organizing Mindanao resistance to the dictatorship. Enrile and a young group of military soldiers that he had secretly been seeing believed the Marcos presidency would not survive for long. One of the young officers he trusted and kept close the most, Colonel Gregorio Gringo Honasan, all of 38 in 1986, Honasan told Probe in an interview years later.
Nung nagkakadayaan na, minamanipulate na yung bilangan, sabi namin, walang pag-asa ito. Sabi namin, sasabog ito.
Beyond the strategizing and the politics of it all, Jack Enrile said his father was already struggling with everything he could no longer deny.
So I wrote my father. His reaction was he called me in the lanai in his house and he started to cry. And he said how ashamed he was.
Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel V. Ramos, two key implementers of martial law, finally broke from Marcos. On February 22, 1986, after weeks of civil disobedience, they and a band of military reformists called on their fellow soldiers to defect. Marcos would dig in their heels at Malacanang, while the opposition and religious leaders such as Cardinal Jaime Sin, head of the Philippine Catholic Church, called on the people to rally behind the rebels. 4 days later, despite holding his own inauguration, Marcos, with Imelda and their children, were flown by the U.S. Navy to Hawaii. Cory held her own inauguration in Club Filipino in San Juan.
Raise your right hand.
Beside her,
and repeat after me.
Juan Ponce Enrile.
Your oath of office. I
Administering her oath, Enrile's friend since the first time they helped Marcos in his 1965 campaign,
that I will faithfully,
Justice Claudio Tihanki.
Conscientiously
fulfill my duties.
It was not just in the Philippines. The final decades of the 20th century witnessed a remarkable wave of peaceful revolutions and uprisings. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989 dismantled communist rule. The fall of the Berlin Wall in the same year marked a symbolic end to the Cold War, fueling democratic ideals across former Soviet blocs in Europe. In Indonesia, Suharto's regime crumbled in 1998 under sustained popular pressure. Wherever democracy was regained, there was a sense that all was finally right. But in the 90s and at the start of the 21st century, in the Philippines, the euphoria of ousting a dictator gave way, with every leader, to the harsh realities of dysfunctional politics and compromised governance. No, being in the right was no guarantee of stability or unconditional love. Over the next 3 decades, Enrile found that out for himself too. By the second decade of the 21st century, Enrile was entering his 90s, and he was considered by many, simultaneously and without irony, as a wise elder as well as a criminal and crook. He and his chief of staff, Gigi Reyes, remain central to what has come to be known as the pork barrel scam, one of the biggest corruption scandals since the fall of the Marcoses. He was hounded, still is, by accusations and actual charges, from rights abuses to corruption, and his hand was always suspected in every murmuring of vulnerability in whichever administration. And 1 week before he turned 99, in February 2023, one big case against Enrile, that one alleging that he and Danding Cuanco had diverted Coco Lery funds, that case was dismissed. But only because that case had been filed when Enrile was a much younger man of 66 in 1990. By 2023, Cuanco and 4 other co-defendants to that case were already long dead. As for Enrile, it had been 33 years of a case already. The court said Enrile's constitutional rights to a speedy trial had been violated. In other words, the dismissal seemed to say, Marcos cronies, and the very limits of the law. Juan Ponce Enrile had simply outlived them all.
Naniniwala akong hindi ako iniwan ng Panginoon.
How will he ultimately be judged?
Bukod sa nagtagal ang aking buhay, nalampasan ko rin ang mga hamon at tukso ng politika.
Enrile has always been credited, alongside Cory, Ramos, and Cardinal Sin, as among the main players of EDSA.
Sa aking buhay, ang tanging kinatatakutan ko ay ang paghuhusga ng Diyos at ng kasaysayan.
But he would quickly regain his tag as villain.
Kailangan natin si Manong Johnny.
He would enter politics, losing some but winning more, enough to have been an influence and factor and controversial voice at every juncture, with literally every president.
Sa talas at galing, si Manong Johnny.
Gusto ko, happy ka!
When he first became senator in 1987, Enrile started to leave a legacy of legislations he could rightfully claim credit for. Over 4 terms, Enrile worked to reform the electricity sector and then the telecommunications industry, playing a crucial role for Filipino consumers. He championed the Senior Citizens Act and was instrumental in the Anti-Money Laundering Act, crucial to fighting corruption and financial crimes. But his support for controversial national security and anti-terror laws would inevitably invoke the specter of Marcos, and he would never rid himself of that stigma.
Marami rin tayong hinarap ng mga pagsubok.
He was senator when Joseph Estrada was impeached. When he voted against presenting a contentious piece of evidence, voted against opening an envelope, Enrile had a hand in unleashing protests that ousted Estrada all the same, and that opened the door for Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. Under Gloria, he would be tied to coup attempts and charges of corruption once again. When Cory's son, Noynoy Aquino, became president, Enrile was already 87, but he was strong and influential still, enough to become Senate president. And so when another historic impeachment, this time against Arroyo appointee Supreme Court Chief Justice Renato Corona, was called for, it was Enrile who presided over the trial. The case revolved around charges of corruption, unexplained wealth, and betrayal of public trust. Many found that ironic. Charges of corruption, of betrayal of public trust, of his own questionable place in history, of his own questioned morals, would be resurrected and loved against Enrile right there on the Senate floor. Even as he stood as one of its most senior members, again and again, in the drama and scandals of government after government, opportunity after opportunity presented itself for critics to confront Enrile with litany after litany of all that he, too, had yet to fully answer for. Here, for example, was his former staff at the Department of Justice, Miriam Defensor Santiago, who was now his fellow senator.
Yes, absolutely, no credibility.
Here now was the son of Renato Cayetano, himself a former senator. Alan Peter was a grade schooler in shorts when Enrile set up a law firm with the older Cayetano.
Alam natin kung paano niyo po pinapatakbo ang Senado. or more accurately, how you, an attorney or Ma'am Gigi, runs the Senate? Paano ba nangyayari sa Senado ang pera?
Cayetano and Defensor Santiago in these moments were giving voice to what many Filipinos believed. That Enrile, the survivor, was plainly duplicitous. He was a hypocrite. He was a master of doublespeak,
My attacker is the icon of shameless lying.
conspiring with the Marcoses to reverse what he himself had once exposed and confirmed to the public.
Ambushed, thus laying the ground for the imposition of martial law. Under President Corazon Aquino, he retracted and admitted his ambush was fake and staged. Then, under President Benigno Aquino III, he retracted again. He now claims in his memoirs that the ambush was genuine after all. He eats his own words for breakfast.
Talagang ganun eh, kung wala ka na sa pwesto, makaaway mo, may kapangyarihan sila, ay hindi ako natatakot na ako ipapatayin dahil wala akong inoppress, wala akong inapi, wala akong pinahirapan, wala akong ninakawan ng pera.
The man is an incorrigible liar and criminal, as brought out by the litany of his crimes against the Filipino people. Number 1, command responsibility for death and disappearance during martial law.
When Rodrigo Roa Duterte became president in 2016, Enrile backed efforts to transfer the dictator's remains to the libingan ng mga bayani. For everything that he had become, critics scoffed. Enrile never really changed. Enrile was 92, and his politics had indeed come full circle. Back not only to Marcos, but Marcos the Good, Marcos the Visionary, Marcos the President whose every centavo Enrile could help explain.
Lord, we are now on our 17th day in this impeachment trial.
But here too was Senator Coco Pimentel, delivering the opening prayers on the 17th day of the Corona impeachment trials, with a special prayer for Enrile. He also happened to be celebrating his 88th birthday that day.
We ask you to continue to bless our presiding officer.
It was a remarkable scene. Not only was this man praying, the son of an opposition leader, Nene Pimentel, whom Enrile had helped to send to prison during martial law.
Control his blood pressure so he can continue to ably lead and guide.
As Coco Pimentel prayed, TV cameras scanned the room, and there in every corner of the Senate floor, head bowed in prayer, were the direct descendants of so many people Enrile had helped, or crossed, or both. As Coco Pimentel prayed for the man he can rightfully blame for wrongfully imprisoning his father, here was Senator Jinggoy, son of the deposed Joseph Estrada. There was Senator Bongbong Marcos, two Cayetanos, Alan and his sister Pia. Present was the senator's son and namesake of Senator Teofisto Gingona, who would become Gloria Arroyo's vice president after Estrada was overthrown. Chis Escudero, son of Ferdinand Marcos' last Minister of Agriculture. Over the 4 terms that Enrile served, the session hall was occupied by children and descendants of almost every Philippine president Enrile lived through. Osmeñas, Arojas, Magsaysay, Macapagal, Juan Aquino, 2 Marcoses. Most everyone with whom he prowled and sat here, they were all living evidence of all that have changed and that do not change through the history that Juan Ponce Enrile continues to influence. As the Philippines entered 2024, a familiar issue became news of the day. Efforts to change the Constitution was being perceived as efforts to perpetuate people in power. This was not new. Ninoy Aquino had leveled the same charges as far back as 1981.
He started maneuvering to change our form of government from an American-type presidential system to a British-type parliamentary so that he can be elected as a deputy from Ilocos, become prime minister, and then stay on forever. That was the plan.
The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. And when in February 2024, the current Senate President, Miguel Zubiri, assured that all talk of a people's initiative for charter change will finally be put to rest, he invoked the assurances of 2 people.
4 in the afternoon, and she asked me if I could see the President today at 10 a.m. together with Senate President Juan Ponce Enrile and
Unseen but not unheard.
Stop. No, he said he will tell the initiators of this PI to stop.
To Enrile, Zubiri assured, Ferdinand Marcos II would listen.
Kumukontra po si Senate President Juan Ponce Enrile.
1 week later, President Marcos was throwing a party right there in Malacanang. He offered a toast on Enrile's birthday.
As clever as you, at 100 years old.
The president thanked Enrile for his good advice and guidance.
Continuing to provide service to your country, continuing to give good advice,
Juan Furaganan was born at a time when the average Filipino would have been fortunate to live past 30. The day after the palace party in his honor, Juan Ponce Enrile awoke to another day as advisor, still to a President of the Republic of the Philippines. He was 100 years and another day old.
Ako po si Robbie Alampay, Puma Podcast. 100 Years of JPE in the Philippines is a special series produced for Puma Podcast Teka Teka News. This episode was written by me with help and editing by Veronica Uy Vitug and Jill Caro. Research for this podcast leaned on news archives, publicly available records, Enrile's autobiography edited by the journalist Nelson Navarro, Juan Ponce Enrile, a memoir. And for interview elements with Enrile himself, we relied on the library of Probe Archives. Maraming salamat po.